I drove 600 miles to fix a mistake I didn't make, and when I finally turned onto the gravel road at Finch Lake, a bulldozer was already chewing through my father's old A-frame, while a woman in a red blazer smiled like she was cutting a ribbon clipboard tucked against her ribs as if it were a badge. She glanced at my dusty boots at the keys still warm in my palm and said, "You didn't just inherit a cabin. You inherited a problem." She didn't know that buried in the same file my father left me was a tripwire that could bulldoze her entire little kingdom. My name is Joe Bannon, and if you've ever stood there watching something you love get turned into a pile of splinters while a person with a clipboard calls it progress, you already know the taste in my mouth that morning, part metal, part coffee, part fire. I hadn't spoken to my father in 40 years, not since I was a kid, who didn't understand why silence can be its own kind of apology. But he left me this cabin and a manila envelope with a deed and a ring of keys. No letter, no explanation. And I told myself I was going to read his last sentence by repairing the thing he knew how to write 4 walls and a roof. The lake flashed through the pines like a promise. Then the promise snapped because the A-frame was already opened like a wound, and the stone chimney stood there like a headstone, and the bulldozer idled low and hungry. The woman detached herself from the crew and came my way. Without bending the gravel. Sprayed hair, perfect lipstick, nameplate that said Darla Reams Finch, Lake Estates, HOA President voice, crisp like cold glass. "Emergency action," she said, tapping the clipboard unpresentable. "Structure visual hazard board, authorized a demolition to protect community values." Then she slid a pink slip at me for a $500 emergency fee and smiled the way a banker smiles while he takes your house key. I told her I was the owner now that I had the deed in the truck, that you cannot implode a home without notifying the person who owns it. And she gave me that patient look people reserve for children and said, "We sent notices to the address on file. If your father neglected his mail, that isn't our fault." My father was dead, but I swallowed that, walked past her to the foreman, asked for the county permit, and watched the big man glance not at me, but at Darla, and that told me everything. I did what training taught me, what pride never wants to do. I disengaged and drove to the county administration building, ugly block of concrete fluorescent lights that buzz like flies, the smell of dry paper and bad coffee, and the young clerk, Millie O'Connor, pulled up my parcel and said, "There is no demolition order on file for that lot," and it felt like a lungful of air after a long dive. She started to print the screen. Then an older woman with a severe haircut slid in with a smile that didn't smile and said, "Let me try." And in less than a minute, an emergency order appeared with a timestamp from the last hour. Wrong font signature that looked traced by a shaky hand. And when I said, "That was not there a minute ago," she gave me a shrug as flat as a stamp and said, "The record is the record." Yeah, that happened. I parked down the road where the pines could hide me and watched the last wall fold, the chimney sway and fall, the dust rise like it had something to say, and the anger went somewhere colder and sharper, because people who fake one permit don't stop at one, and if they're bold enough to erase a man's last apology while he's in the ground, you'd better believe they have friends in low offices. So I stopped trying to win the argument and started building a map. For a week, I lived at the records office, hands black with microfilm dust eyes stinging from bad scans and worse coffee. And on day 5, I founded a 1982 hand-drawn plat that showed Finch Lake Estates like neat little teeth, and in the center, a big irregular parcel labeled Finch Lake County Land Trust, with my father's old lot carved out of that, like a stubborn island. I dug deeper and pulled the trust deed thick as a phone book. 12 layers of clauses and subclauses that looked like a conservation shell, until you hit Layer 8 contingent ownership and fiduciary transfer. The kind of title that makes you yawn until you read the line that says, if the beneficiaries ever infringe or improperly encumber the grantor's designated parcel control of the trust, transfers to the grantor's legal heir. I read it twice, then a third time, and the room got very quiet. My father hadn't just owned a cabin at the edge of their map. He had wired that map with a switch, and Darla had stomped right on it. I took the papers to Alistair Finch, retired county surveyor. Hands like oak roots, eyes like a plumb line, and he ran a knuckle along the boundary and grinned. Your old man built a minefield, he said. Said one day the clipboard crowd would get greedy. He wanted the lake safe from busybodies and condo men. Looks like you found his detonator. You know what I mean. When I say the temperature changed inside me, the grief cooled. The focus came up like a clean horizon. I called my old buddy Tomas Rivera, a combat engineer who could frame a wall straight in a storm, and he said I'll be there Thursday. Don't argue, and that was that. That night, Millie called from a blocked number voice low and told me the older clerk was Darla's sister-in-law, that they'd been doing this trick for years, backdating fines and permits, that she had copies of invoices where residents were charged $1,000 for a $65 patch, where the HOA billed $5,000 for an algae treatment. That never happened, and then she told me the big one, that she'd found a preliminary contract with a developer to sell off shoreline access for a private marina and luxury condos. If only one abandoned parcel stopped being a problem. Mine. The next morning I bought a gas auger and chain link and wrapped my boundary with 6 feet of steel-set posts in concrete until my shoulders shook. Let people drive by slow and stare while I didn't wave, because indifference is its own message. Tomas showed up with tools and that grin that says we're going to do this the hard way, and we sorted the wreckage into piles like we were laying out bones. Salvage here, scrap there, a foundation cleared down to something that could hold. At night, Millie sent me receipts and scans, and I decided I couldn't afford a lawsuit, and I didn't need one. Not if I could get everyone in one place and make the truth stand up on its own 2 legs. I filed for a county-permitted community workshop. Free lessons in framing and sustainable rebuild. Open to the public, held on my private parcel, where the HOA had no jurisdiction. And when Darla slid a letter through my gate, warning of $200 fines for anyone parking along the county road, I taped it to the fence and wrote under it. Not how any of this works. Saturday morning came cool and bright, and by 9, the shoulder was a parade of pickup trucks and minivans, folks walking in with tool belts and crock pots, the air full of sawdust, and chilly kids tossing a football near the pines, and the sound of hammers hitting true across the water felt like the opposite of a bulldozer. Around noon, Darla strutted in with Hal Dorsey, her mall cop enforcer in mirrored sunglasses, and they moved through my open gate like inspectors at a petting zoo, waiting for fear. But nobody scattered. Nobody even paused. And it hit me indifference is a vote, counted out loud. I walked to the shoreline where they could see me, and folded open the trust deed to Layer 8. Then held up my phone with the county's stamp, because that morning my lawyer had filed the transfer. You didn't just knock down my cabin. I told her quiet enough to make her lean in. You tripped the leash. Control of the Finch Lake Land Trust sits with me now. The crowd went from chatter to a murmur to a hush. Someone whispered, "Does he own the lake?" And Darla's face drained. Then she snapped back into that brittle smile and said, "Ancient paperwork doesn't override modern bylaws." But her voice had a wobble in it she couldn't iron out. That evening, a certified letter requested my attendance at an emergency HOA meeting open to the public, and I said sure, because rooms like that are where truth either dies or stands up. The community center was hot and crowded, every folding chair full, people lined 3 deep along the walls, a buzz in the air like summer before a storm. Darla sat up front with Hal, and the sister-in-law papers stacked like sandbags banged a plastic gavel and tried to sell the room on outsiders and misunderstandings and dusty files that didn't fit today's values. And then she asked if there were questions. I didn't raise my hand. I walked down the center aisle and set a small recorder on the table and pressed play, and Darla's own voice filled the room cold and sharp, telling Mrs. Gable, 82, and sitting in the front row in a trembling cardigan, that her petunias were unauthorized, and that at her age, she wouldn't want to lean on the house if she didn't comply within 48 hours. The sound that rolled through the crowd wasn't a gasp. It was a growl, low and human. I passed out copies invoices next to real contractor receipts. $1,000 billed for a $65 job. $5,000 billed for an algae treatment never performed. And then I held up the developer's preliminary contract, and finally the stamped trust transfer. "You don't get to sell the lake," I said, voice low and simple. "You don't even get to walk across it without my permission." Alistair stood in the back and called for a vote of no confidence and immediate resignation, and hands went up like a field of wheat in wind. 2 deputies stepped in. Millie slipped them the file with the forged permit and the bank records. And when they cuffed Darla, the room didn't cheer. It just watched her go, like watching a storm move off the water. Here's the part I want to argue about with you, because that's how we get better right. If a community gives too much power to a few neighbors with clipboards, are we surprised when the clipboards turn into weapons? If a land trust can protect a lake from condo money, should one heir hold the key, or should the key be locked where no one person can reach? Tell me where you stand. Tell me if the HOA on your street saved your block or scared you into pulling up your flowers. Drop your story in the comments. Push back. If you think I'm wrong, and if you believe a family's legacy shouldn't be bulldozed out of spite, hit subscribe. We've got more to build, and some clipboards are already shaking.